So, piano player, huh?
Actually, my first job out of college was a nanny.
Excellent.
Manny. I was a manny for 5 years.
How many kids?
2 boys.
2 boys. Nice.
For 5 years, that was my day job.
Excellent. And then how'd you get into music?
I've been playing music since I was a little kid, 7, 8 years old. I played piano. And when I graduated college, I went to Stanford undergrad, and I was a poli-sci major. So I was unemployable when I graduated. But I wanted to play music. Didn't know how I was going to make a living at it. And nanny was the logical job to take. So I went to a placement agency called Mothers Indeed. And actually, when I called them, they said they didn't interview men. What the fuck are you talking about, you know? I went in, I got the first job I interviewed for. So, big source of pride.
Outstanding. Way to go. And then you decided you wanted an easy job, a relaxing job, a mellow job, a job that did not require you to invest a lot of time or energy. And so you founded Pandora.
Right. Yeah, so after a bunch of years playing in bands, living out of a van for a while, and then being a film composer, in 2000, I was living in the Bay Area. So therefore, I started a company. And had this idea for the Music Genome Project, and in March of 2000, after sharing it with a good friend of mine who had already had sort of a run as a CEO, decided to kind of take a shot at this thing. And in March of 2000, literally 3 weeks before everything fell off a cliff, we raised $1.5 million of angel financing. Garage.com was our first investor, if you remember them, Guy Kawasaki and his crew. And then we set off on this adventure, and that initial money lasted us about a year, a little over a year, and then in 2001, we began running out of money.
Good timing.
Yeah. And the door was shut on Sandhill, as you guys probably remember. Knowing that it was going to be a sort of a long road, we began to conserve cash, began asking our employees to defer an ever larger portion of their salary. So paid less and less cash and more in options until by the end of 2001, we stopped paying people altogether. And then for a little over 2 years, 50 people worked without getting paid to keep Pandora alive, which is illegal in California, by the way.
Wait, 50 people
Yeah.
for 2 years, you didn't pay salaries?
No, we didn't pay salaries. We didn't pay them anything.
That was low stress, I assume.
Yeah. By the end of 2003, I pitched Pandora 348 times to investors. I had 11 maxed out credit cards. And we were being sued by 5 employees for having violated California labor laws by asking people to work for free. And we were doing it in Oakland, which was the single most labor-friendly county in the country. So I was actually preparing for a court case, because at that time the corporate veil had not been firmly established, and we could have gone to jail for doing this, because there was no separation between officers and their companies. So yeah, it was a little bit of stress. But pitch number 348 got a firm named Walden VC to step up. Larry Marcus, who invested, who was a drummer, which probably explains it.
Need some guitar players in your set.
Yeah. And I'll just a capstone of this period. In end of 2003, I left to get married in India. My wife is from India, and I was in the middle of my honeymoon. The round was all teed up to close, and I'd logged in and was sort of corresponding, and it was falling apart. So I left my wife on our honeymoon, flew back to the U.S. for about 4 or 5 days to get it all back on track, and then rejoined her back in Kerala, and closed $9 million in March of 2004 and paid out $2 million of back salary, which is an all-hands meeting I will never forget. You know, we got everybody together, which we did every couple of weeks, actually about every week, for my pep talk, which was like, hey guys, let's go 2 more weeks without getting paid, you know? And instead of that, I said, hey, you know, pulled out of my back pocket, and I get goosebumps when I say this, and I flopped down like 20 envelopes on the table and like handed them out, checks for everybody, almost $2 million of salary. And I think everybody thought it was some bad joke, you know, the checks were going to bounce. But I paid out, which is unusual, as you guys know, in the VC world, to pay for past problems. But then that was sort of chapter 1, and then kind of moved on. So that was my experience.
Ballpark, how many users does Pandora have today?
100 million every few months.
And market cap of?
little lower than it used to be, but about $2 billion.
$2 billion
Yeah.
market cap, 100 million
Yeah.
monthly actives or whatever.
Yeah, so that was chapter 2, which was a much more pleasant experience than the first 4 years. But I think we're going to talk a bit about this. You know, whenever am among entrepreneurs, especially in these settings, people talk a lot about, you know, product market fit, you know, technology and so on. And not a lot of time is spent on the human side of being an entrepreneur. A lot of people kind of don't want to talk about that. It's how hard it is and the things we all go through. I think that more attention needs to be paid to that. It's certainly something I want to do in my role here. Speaking of which, you know, I think Dan calls himself the troll under the bridge at Box. But you stepped in with a 24-year-old exuberant founder.
4 of them.
4 of them.
Collect them, trade them with your friends, win valuable prizes. 4 24-year-old founders.
So you had a low-stress job, too.
So,
But, you know, I think you were the guy behind the curtain. You know, I'm sure there was plenty of talent in the founding team, but you were there for 7 years and went from, I think, 10 to 500 million in revenue, am I right? So that doesn't happen all that often, where a new guy, more senior, comes in and the founder survives, that sort of pairing works. So talk about, you know, that experience, what worked, what didn't, and, you know, how you guys managed to make it through that.
So a lot of you are thinking about the path forward, and there are 2 obvious paths, and we represent the 2 paths. So at Box, Aaron remained the CEO, and he built a leadership team around him that could support him and enable him to be successful. I was part of that team. And at Pandora, you chose to move into a different role and bring in a fit of pure genius, an auto industry executive to be CEO. I want to hear more about that one. But yeah, Aaron is a very unusual guy. I'm sure many of you know him. I know he's an investor in a bunch of your companies. He is, and even was at the age of 24, unbelievably thoughtful about his strengths and weaknesses, extremely self-aware, and very focused on a simple fact, which was there was all kinds of shit work that he didn't want to do, and he wanted somebody else to do it. And I drew the short straw. So, you know, 7 years later, I realized that through sheer luck and good timing, I had ended up at the right place at the right time, and it was an amazing ride.
Did you enter with the aspiration to become CEO, or were you like, I'm okay being the kind of guy behind the scenes?
So Aaron had been trying to hire a chief revenue officer, and I had been interviewing people, and they were all terrible. And after we had interviewed somebody, he would say, why can't I just hire you? And I would say, A, I'm not going to take a job that's not a CEO job, and B, I'm not going to work for a 24-year-old. Go away. And one night, I was up in Northern California. I have a cabin up there that I own with a couple of other families, and I was getting completely hammered on good red wine in front of a lovely fire in April. And this really good buddy of mine looked at me, and he said, why won't you take this job? And I said, you know, I'm not going to work for a 24-year-old, and I'm not going to not be a CEO. And he said, you're an idiot. You like these people. You think the product is cool and can really help, and you think you could make a difference. You could, like, make these guys' lives better. Why won't you do that? So I came back to Aaron, and I said, I will not do this CRO job that you're trying to hire somebody to do. But here's a job description of a job I will do. And if you want me to do that job, I'll start tomorrow. And I'd been an advisor for a year at this point, so we knew each other really well.
And what do you think he did to set you up for success? Like, that could have been a pretty unpleasant experience. What did he do to make that work from his side?
I think the biggest things were really simple in theory and incredibly difficult in practice. First is we had absolute role clarity. It was crystal clear who got to make which calls, and he and I would sync up every Sunday to make sure that there was no forum shopping going on. And he was really good about redirecting people to me. So if it was a decision that I was supposed to make, even though last Friday he would have made it, on Monday he would say, that's not my decision anymore, go talk to Dan. That was absolutely critical. We used to talk about the fact that if we both had to be in the same meeting, that was a very bad sign. It should be clear that only one of us needed to be there. And then the other thing I already talked about, he listened. and he was open to the idea that he wasn't perfect. In fact, he embraced the idea that he wasn't perfect and that he didn't want to do a bunch of this stuff. And that really made it possible for me to step up and put some points on the board. And in the end, that was sort of the critical thing. Somebody said today, Jeff Bezos, I think, said, good managers are right a lot. If you ever find yourself onboarding in that kind of situation, be right a lot early on. Later, you can screw up all you want. But in the first month, you need to be right a lot because you've got to build some credibility.
We do. It's funny because there's a little asymmetry here where I was the guy bringing in the CEO, and we looked at a lot of CEOs to fill that position back then. And I was a very willing sort of founder to move along. I wanted that job.
Were you clear you didn't want the job?
Yeah. And I was invited to do it, but it just isn't what I wanted to do. And I didn't think it was the best use of my skills, which I think is a question that entrepreneurs need to constantly ask themselves. Because having the CEO title, people can get attached to it. But for most companies, founders outgrow that. You know, there's not that many that really are the best person for that job over the long haul.
And you were completely focused on the success of the business.
Yeah, 100%.
So you wanted to do whatever you could do that would add the most value. And if that wasn't being CEO, you were okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we looked at a lot of CEOs, a lot of clowns. I mean, it is hard to hire a good CEO. We took our time about it. And actually, I got a lot of pressure on the board because they kept saying, hey, Tim, like something's going on. You're saying no to everybody. Like you're hanging on too long here. And I didn't give in to that pressure. Thank God. It would have been easy to do that because the optics of it weren't good. Here I was kind of, someone might say passively aggressively hanging on to the CEO job. That wasn't what it was. And then I met Joe Kennedy, as Dan said, is a car guy, came from Saturn, which is not your typical car company. And just...
Is that their tagline or something? Not your typical car company?
Was it?
Something like that.
That might have been. That would have made sense. But...
Apple hired a cola salesman and you hired a car guy. What were you thinking?
I mean, it's funny. It's not in the music business, like... He walked in like a blue blazer and checkered shirt and khaki pants. Like he wasn't cut out to be in the entertainment business and music. It wasn't, but phenomenally smart, a double E undergrad, HBS guy, Baker Scholar, super sharp, and an ego, the opposite, like super low ego guy. He was really curious. He came in clearly with a lot of respect and love for the company. And so I thought, here's a guy who's going to come in and we'll sort of really be a team player. And we had kind of this match made in heaven, I think, like you and Aaron did. And we had great role clarity. The things that I was good at and wanted to do, he was not and didn't want to do, and vice versa. And so that allowed us to thrive for a bunch of years. And I think, you know, even just in the last few days, I've talked to a bunch of entrepreneurs, some of whom are wrestling with this decision, which is, I think, the biggest one you can make. But I think founders being really open-eyed about this decision is really, really important to your success, because if you don't do it, you'll become miserable personally and less effective over time. But if you recognize it early enough and spend the time to find a good partner, it can become the best job in the world, because then you get to do all the things you're really good at that really kind of, you thrive and you'll kind of become your full self, which is my experience was, and it would have been the opposite had I decided to stay in that job, I think.
That's awesome. And what are you going to do at Coastal Ventures?
So I don't know yet. In other words, I don't know how I'm going to split my time. Obviously looking for new companies for sure, especially early stage stuff. Consumers obviously my personal passion, but I also want to dip in and help on an operating side, and where I can be helpful to folks that are looking for assistance. And I think what I'll bring to that, much like you, Dan, I think, is having really been there and walked in those shoes. And when I talk to entrepreneurs talking about some really bad situation they're going in, almost every time I've literally been in that exact same position. And I think being able to sort of empathize, was it compassion, empathy, that distinction someone was talking about today?
Compassion, good, empathy, bad. That's
right.
what I remember.
Okay, so I shouldn't be empathetic. Fuck empathy. I'll be compassionate. But
if you're empathetic, the boulder crushes me.
That's right. That's right. I will not leave the boulder on you. But I think that in my experience with investors over the years, and had many of them at Pandora, almost without exception, the ones who were the most valuable to me were folks who had operating experience, had been either founders or had really been in the trenches, because they just know what you're going through. You're not a spreadsheet to them. You're not a P&L. You're like a human being. And I would say that in the world of startups and entrepreneurship, the one great missing ingredient is the humanist part. Like the human side of it. What is someone going through? How do you survive? How do you create a sustainable life? A lot of entrepreneurs are working at a pace and in an environment they just can't sustain personally.
Because the wall's going to fall down from the wind.
Yeah, it's kind of a metaphor. And so I think a lot of more attention needs to be paid to that. And I think, Khosla is unusual in having people who've been there. A lot of people have been there. So I think that we can really make a contribution. I want to ask you about oh shit moments you had at Box and how you handle them inside, because everybody has them, and talk about them.
I would answer that question, but we're getting the hook, so I'm going to answer a different question, which is, what am I going to do at Khosla Ventures?
Nicely done.
I'm super excited to be here. And I really believe that we've got a new generation of founder CEOs in the Valley that we didn't have 20 years ago. And it's a horribly lonely job. Who do you call when you're trying to figure out whether to fire that long-time executive? Who do you call when you're grappling with a really rough problem? For many of you, the answer could be, hopefully will be, you'll call your investing partner at Khosla. But sometimes that can be a challenging thing. You don't want to feel judged. If you ask for help, that feels like maybe you're showing weakness. But you need help, and you need help from somebody who knows what the hell they're talking about, who's been there and done that, and that's what I'm here to do. So I'm not going to be making investments. I'm not going to rat you out to your investing partner. That's not my job. My job is to help in any way that I can. To coach you, to teach your leadership team, to just be there to answer questions in a non-judgmental way based on 30 years of experience in the Valley. And maybe to reach out to a Keith Rabois who's got a long operating background, or Bruce Armstrong who's got a long operating background, or Tim, but in a way that obfuscates the question and protects you from being exposed. And I'm going to give a little talk tomorrow afternoon on building a killer e-staff, and I'll talk there about some of the other things that I might be able to do to help. So if you're interested, come by and take a listen. I met a lot of you, and I'm looking forward to meeting the rest.
All right, thank you all.